It's usually when we start these webinars where we ask the individuals concerned where you're dialing in from. Maybe we should appropriately ask, what temperature is it at around the UK and beyond and abroad? That might go, and then we could plot everybody's geographical location based upon temperature or how hot they are feeling here. I don't know if you want to do that, just to test if the chat function does work down there, which is denoted, if you didn't know, on Zoom by the single or the individual speech bubble that's at the top or the bottom of your screen there. You can post any questions anonymously to our panel today by the using the Q&A function, which is denoted by the 2 speech bubbles, again, at the top of your screen there. Hopefully, okay, all right, we've got some interest already in there. Okay, Simon, okay, thank you. That's 21, that's bearable. Lisa, 27. Okay. Okay. You got 27. So if all our laptops shut up, I think mine's already on warning that it might actually pack up at 30 degrees. It might top out there. So you may be listening to the sound of silence, not by Garfunkel, if it gets too hot in Kingston here. Okay, thank you very much. You can actually post your temperatures or degrees of your laptop anonymously in the 2 speech bubbles denoted by in the Q&A as well there. And if you do have any questions on the topic that we were meant to be talking about, rather than the temperature of the country, on governance, then you can actually post that in the Q&A section. We'll be looking to kickstart just after 2 o'clock today, and do appreciate we didn't pick the hottest day or one of the hottest day of the years intentionally for this webinar. It just so happened to be that way there. Let's just kick this off. Yeah. Thank you, Toyin. 26 degrees. Gosh, who can complain? Who can complain, eh? Yeah. What we will do after the webinar is that we will probably refer to a number of papers, either by the regulator or by the EBA. And what we'll do is that we'll send those out to you after the webinar, along with the slide deck in PDF version. The questions, there is a checklist at the end of this webinar, questions that we've come up with that we thought might trigger a debate that you can take away in your firms and organizations. So again, we've got a cut out and keep version that you can use there that we sent out to you by the end of the week. If you do want to reach out to us prior to that, I will make sure that the details of this webinar and the contact details of the individual panelists, Adrian Harvey, and also colleagues from Hogan Lovells who'll be joining us on this webinar will be distributed accordingly as well there. Just wait a couple of minutes for the last people to join us, and then we'll get started. Okay, let's get started then. Thank you very much indeed for joining us on this joint webinar with Elephants Don't Forget and Hogan Lovells, where we bring you right up to date with all you need to know about everything that matters within financial services. You could be forgiven that we magically created this webinar on governance in anticipation of the issues and the challenges in British politics at the moment, but alas, we didn't have that type of foresight with us here. But we do have today to cool your brow to discuss why effective ESG starts with governance. Our 2 distinguished panelists, Frank Brown, Senior Director of Hogan Lovells Financial Services Regulatory Consulting, and Adrian Harvey, who is the CEO of Elephants Don't Forget. And over the next 50 minutes, what we wanted to do is cover off a number of the key issues that we shared with you in the description and the overview of this webinar. And we want you to take away not only just an overall understanding of why the G is so important in ESG, but we also wanted to make sure that you have practical, relevant and timely insights and checklists, as I said at the start of the webinar, for you to take away and implement. So we'll be covering off a number of these topic areas that you see on the screen, why ESG needs to be led by governance, and we'll be certainly riffing off the report that Frank posted. Again, I'll send you the link to that. I'll post it on LinkedIn. We'll also be talking about the role of compliance plays in delivering and orchestrating and implementing the board's direction and mission around putting governance first in ESG, looking at the metrics, data and evidence to support strategic decision making, and also about what robust governance really does look like when we talk about ESG. And again, what we want to do is make this an interactive session. So it'll be great if you could participate in an exchange of views. You may not agree with all what we have to say, but we welcome that debate and that discussion. You can do that through the chat function there. We've also got a number of poll questions. One will be coming up shortly, which we just want to sense check your understanding and your take on subject areas so that we can pivot this time that we have together to make sure it's relevant to you. And again, recording of this webinar as well as the slide deck will be sent to you afterwards. You have the opportunity also to sign up to Hogan Lovells updates on ESG and also the latest thought leadership produced by both Elephants Don't Forget and Hogan Lovells there. And Frank, do you want to just kick us off? And you know what, we don't want to send, this is not governance for dummies, but we do want to actually just set what we do mean by governance. Do you just want to walk and talk us through that to start off with, please?
Yeah, I mean, this sort of overarching governance framework is the rules, controls, policies and personnel that steward the organisation and drive the strategic direction of the organisation. And personnel is, includes sort of capacity, capability and also inclination as well. And within an area like ESG, that is particularly important. So the framework, the terms of reference, the individuals, the extent, the committee structure beneath them, how frequently they meet, what sort of information goes up, what sort of minutes come down, etc., to achieve these objectives that people are looking for. So setting the strategic direction, as it says, developing that appropriate culture, maintaining that culture in the organisation, driving the business forward for the benefit of the shareholders, but equally these days are much more of a consideration for wider stakeholders and this idea of sustainability in all terms, growth and longevity for the organisation, which sometimes includes not quite saving shareholders from themselves, but taking decisions for that long-term view as opposed to that short-term view.
And it'd be interesting to sense check where our participants are prioritizing, if they are prioritizing E, the S and the G. So you should see on your screens now, just a simple question, is not there to catch you out in any shape or form. What ESG themes are being prioritized in your firm? Is it the environmental, social, governance, as Frank has just talked about? Are you taking it in equal measure? Maybe you're not sure, or none of the above. And if you're not none of the above, that's okay. Be great to post that in the chat. Just give us a reason why that may be the case, or pose that in the question where you can tick the anonymous so your name won't be disclosed to ourselves or other participants there. So what are the ESG themes being prioritized in your firm? Frank, whilst people deliberate on this, why is this, sorry, I should say, what are you seeing in firms that you're working with at Hogan Lovells there, and where are they prioritizing their efforts?
I mean, realistically, with most firms, or an awful lot of firms we're dealing with, and firms we know in the marketplace, an awful lot of it is on the environmental focus, largely due to the fact that most of the firms we deal with are service sector firms, and the E is relatively easy in a service sector firm. If you're not extractive industry, mining or gas or something like that, you're not energy intensive industries, then complying to the E side of things and working towards your net zero is not intrinsically complicated. So we see perhaps a degree of internal greenwashing in organizations, in the sense that we have those recycled coffee cups, we've got that sort of green wall in reception, which we maintain. We're doing our bit, whereas as we'll talk about as this progresses, ESG is bigger than that.
So does that surprise you and Adrian that governance is the lead answer? 44% of the audience saying governance is the priority in the firm, and 26% saying, okay, this is ESG is approached in equal measure between the E and the S and the G.
Frankly, if you asked us before this, as we sometimes do, where do we think it's going to land, that would be the last place I would think it would land. We get, like Frank says, we get speaking with a host of firms in the sector. E and S is where all the, well, E is where all the dialogue is. S is where procurement are at. Yeah, so whenever we enter any sort of procurement dialogue, making sure the social aspects of it are covered off, but the environmental stuff is what or the market wants to talk to us about. And really, governance just doesn't really come up. It may be that this is somewhat skewed because the nature of the webinar has attracted a whole host of delegates who have governance roles, so that may be inevitable.
Yeah, and I mean, it's very positive to see that, and hopefully what we're saying during the course of this will align, or at least tweaks people's views on what governance means. I mean, certainly seeing social so low is not surprising. As Adrian said, you have some particular requirements around social, but social does bleed into that more subjective area, which is quite difficult to quantify. So it's often sort of shied away from organisations.
And so our second question riffs off our first one, which is really asking individuals, is your firm's approach to ESG risk and opportunities, could be categorized as management responsibly, is it responsive or strategic? And we've given slight descriptions, brief descriptions for those. Is it responsible, responsive, and strategic? And what we mean by responsible is really lands in the CSR category there, and we're making the distinction on this webinar between CSR and ESG. So is it responsible there, and it's driven by CSR, self-regulated, chosen issues and topics within the organization? Is it responsive, and is it strategic there? And that should be on your screen right now. There. And Frank, why is this question important? There.
I think it sort of drives forward, or the answer will, depending on what the answer comes to, will drive forward people's approach to ESG, because certainly a number of organisations, not preempting what people are saying, tend to a bit to the reactive side of things. I have to do this because people have told me I have to do this, or the regulators told me I do this, or I have to fill in this TCFD reporting or something like that, as opposed to a more sort of strategic approach around these are the risks, these are the opportunities, having that mature discussion within the organisation and looking to what do I need to protect, but equally what can I exploit in the nicest possible way to grow my business, develop my business. I mean, when we're talking to firms, we have a sort of continuum of needs to wants. So your needs are your rules and requirements for ESG, and your wants end is much more, if we were to move in this direction, what would be the benefit to us? Or if we were to withdraw from that area, what would be the benefit to us?
Yes, and so comfort in the fact that 42% of the audience are saying that it's strategic and that there is a long-term view. They're playing the long game there, and only 26% saying that perhaps still at the CSR stage.
Yeah, I'm conscious I may have skewed the poll slightly with what I was saying there, but in principle, that should be people's aim to, and we'll talk about this again in a minute, the sort of building ESG or the S&G elements into that strategic planning, longer term view of the organisation.
And so you kicked off this debate, and hence why the webinar on LinkedIn. And you started off with the premise of, saying that governance was the most important part of the E and the S and the G. Go on, provide the case for the defence for us on why you came to that then.
Yeah, I mean, I've always found the ESG concept a little bit strange in the sense that, in my view, you're looking through the wrong end of a telescope, because the E and the S are causal factors of failures that happen in your governance. If you flip it round and you focus on a GSE concept, then if your culture is right, if your purpose is right, if your controls are right within the organization, then your G is sorted, you're flowing into the S, and that should naturally mean that the E, not necessarily takes care of itself, but is controlled accordingly. I mean, we've seen recently, and I'll not mention names, a number of companies getting raided, a number of investment firms getting raided for greenwashing. That's not an ESG failure, that's an intrinsic control failure. That is something you needed to control against, which is not being controlled against in the organization, either through omission or commission, which at its heart, again, is that governance issue. And
so you're making the case for the defence that governance is a priority, and I get that. But in this, what we've listed out here in this infographic here, is it seen now in equal light as ESG risk as it would be operational risk and financial risk, as well as strategic risk?
I mean, not within many organizations, certainly. I mean, firms are not necessarily building the E and S elements into their enterprise risk management framework to an adequate extent. It is still very much a sort of siloed aspect on the side. People are not thinking about the sort of three key risk elements, so your physical risk, your transition risk, and your regulatory and reputational risk, and thinking, as an organization, how does that affect us? What sort of controls do we need to put against that? What sort of opportunities are in there? How will that impact and shift some of our strategic objectives, corporate objectives?
Is that because, I was going to ask you that very thing, is that because we're asking boards and organizations to repurpose and reevaluate the business strategy, which could have a profound negative impact, financial impact potentially, but also positive impacts maybe on the existing business and operational model?
I mean, potentially so. I mean, for some organizations, ESG will present existential risks to them, and it's important that they start to recognize that soon. I mean, obviously, for some of the firms at the sharp end of it, like the oil companies, the gas companies, et cetera, it's very clear. But equally, if we're thinking about financial services as we are, firms who are heavily involved in those sectors, either investing or lending or working with those sectors, are going to have challenges, and it's not always the clear lines of, coal is bad. It is more nuanced than that, and when we get into the S side of things, it becomes increasingly more nuanced and increasingly challenging to tease out where those risks are.
Isn't the issue for boards and the whole governance piece is that you've got first, you see ESG risk from two perspectives. First of all, you've got the impact of ESG risks has on the firm, and secondly, the risk to which the firm is exposing itself to the environment and stakeholders due to its business activities. And requires a more embedded, holistic approach, and that, to get your arms around that, is a struggle for boards as well as for firms.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, an awful lot of the sort of mindset of organizations, and this is across things like operational resilience as well as ESG, and with business continuity previously, is around what's the impact on us, as opposed to what's our impact on the world in general and stakeholders. And this sort of push towards not just shareholders, wider stakeholders, the environment, society, is coming, or is developing, but it's certainly been slowly adopted.
And this is why, I mean, one of your, I want to go back to your article, the failings you said, and I quote, it's always good to quote somebody on back to themselves. The failings in ES areas are at the heart of governance and cultural failures. I just wanted to just throw that out to the audience and ask in the chat whether you just put a 1 if you agree, and put a 2 if you disagree with that. What again, do you want to just reiterate that? Because I think it's a critical point, Frank, that you make, that these are you choosing to use governance, and out of that comes cultural failings. Because I don't think that gets lost in translation, doesn't it? When you see the issues around work hard and other organisations there.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, culture, as with many aspects of ESG, can be an intangible for organisations, and it is something firms find it incredibly difficult to get their arms around, and a lot of organisations sort of shy away from developing it because it's too woolly, it's too soft, it's too intangible. But if you think, and we talked about this last time, that if you think of culture as a lever of control within the organization, if you think of culture as a mechanism to achieve your objectives within the organization, particularly with sort of widely distributed workforces or working in multiple countries, for example, which, if you think about things like bribery controls, for example, in foreign jurisdictions, it's easy for the centre to set a policy, but making sure that actually is implemented in another jurisdiction is hard. So culture as a tool within the organization and aligning that to your risk appetite, to your risk control is the way to focus on it. And then you, from your governance messaging, saying, for example, these are things that we do not do. So modern slavery, for example, the control and oversight of your third parties, the kind of industries you're investing in, the kind of industries you're lending money to. I mean, another common one, palm oil, for example, is very much out of favour now, but an awful lot of trade finance was going in that direction historically.
You'll be glad to know that your fans and your friends and your groupies have agreed with you much more in the chat. Where the rubber hits the road, and I'm going to play you into this, Adrian, in a second, Frank, is where connecting the ESG strategy to the business strategy. And one could be forgiven, Frank, for the fact that there's a flood of information and speculation about future regulatory changes, makes it difficult for firms, in my opinion, to develop a comprehensive strategy for ESG factors. But that's not an excuse not to start, though, is it?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we use a diagnostic tool with firms to help them. So you basically key in the type of firm, the size of firm, and you come to a conclusion of what rules apply. And it is important that organisations make sure that they are aware of which rules apply. So be that modern slavery, be that gender reporting, be that the TCFD stuff they need to do. And that goes back to my earlier point about the sort of needs and wants side of things. So the sort of clear regulatory requirements need to be adhered to. You then get into the more softer side of things around the distinction between can we do something, should we do something. I mean, Ukraine exposed an awful lot of this. We had examples of firms buying cheap oil from Russia during the crisis, which at the start of the crisis they were perfectly able to do, but there was a big question around should you, what's the optics of this, what's the fallout going to be of this. So that woollier, subtler, more intangible side of the social, which brings in a requirement for firms to do more horizon scanning, more sort of insights into social attitudes, opinions, what people are thinking, getting that sort of feel for where the tone of voice is with the public. I mean, an example, we talked about this the other day, a bank allowing their staff members to put their pronouns on their name tags, which got a bit of outcry, and I would suspect that probably a few years from now that wouldn't get as much outcry as it's getting now. That would be a normalized point. So that shift of attitudes is an important one that feeds into this mix.
How do firms make sure that the ESG strategy doesn't become a tick box compliance issue. And we'll talk about the role of compliance and risk managers later. But there's a danger, isn't there, that you're like on this diagram, we've got the strategy, we've got the risk appetite, we've got the operating model, and we've got the controls and the policy and the process. But it becomes another tick box approach, doesn't it? Which is, it's going to be a failure if that approach is taken.
Yeah. I mean, you've got two sides of that. You've got one that, yes, the boxes need ticking. So, within your risk control self-assessment exercises, within your risk appetite, your risk register, et cetera, these risks need to be captured and drawn in and assessed. But equally, they are just another set of risks in your risk taxonomy. The worst thing an organisation can do, in my opinion, is set up a separate risk control framework just for ESG. The E risks, the S risks, the governance risks to a degree should be part of that overarching risk framework. As soon as you start trying to build a separate structure over here, then things are not going to go well at all.
Frank alluded to in his article, Drucker, what doesn't get measured doesn't get managed, Adrian. And at the heart of this model here on the screen, we've got data. The board need ESG data, metrics and optics, as Frank has said, to be able to know whether they are fulfilling their obligations and meeting the mission and vision of the board there. Data is critical to drive this. We talk about how the regulator is increasing their propensity to reliance on data to use as a tool to investigate and to keep firms accountable. But this is going to be critical, isn't it, to make this ESG strategy a reality with data at the center of it.
Yep. What we see, and I'll go back to that poll where we had almost an equal split, three-way split across the audience as to how they viewed ESG. I think it's very complicated. I think the market sees this as complicated. Yeah. And data, I think in some instances the data is really conflicting depending on where you're looking. If you're looking at, I can't remember what you called it, where you're looking at ratings, perhaps. But if you're looking at data relative to the organization itself, frequently it doesn't exist. Yeah. So big components of that data are missing. So where we're engaging with firms in relation to ESG, it is actually culture. Yeah. It's helping the exec, if you will, understand, measure and monitor culture. So I take Frank's point, and it's said in the very best interests. I know, Frank, you do have to tick the box, but sitting below that, it has to be authentic. Yeah. So I think what a lot of firms, a lot of exec are struggling with understanding, which I think plays really well into what Hogan Lovells do anyway. Yeah. They're struggling to understand this. I frequently hear, Frank, firms talk about ESG as being separate to. And before we got in this webinar, we were talking about the fact that governance must be strategic and overarching and cover all of your business. Yeah, with one governance structure, not one with an add-on. Yeah, so effectively having two cultures. So yeah, the answer for me, Philip, is in some instances firms have far too much of the wrong data, and data in relation to perhaps some of the very important stuff around culture, for example, is just non-existent, which is one of the areas that we're helping firms with.
Yeah,
and I mean, incredibly important point there, Adrian. The G of ESG is not as it pertains to ESG. It is G in its holistic sense across your organization. It is the governance of your organization, not just how your governance relates to your environmental or social concerns.
So we've gone one stage down from the board. We've looked at integrating the ESG strategy into the business strategy. Now we're looking at the risk appetite. Frank, the risk strategy needs to be operationalized through a corresponding system of risk appetite statements there. Is that playing out in firms that you're working with, and how is that playing out?
Not to a great extent, and I mean, people often think of risk appetites back to the point of a sort of tick box exercise, but they provide enormous air cover to the organization. If you've got clarity within your risk appetite of, these are lines we do not cross, mostly in relation to capital and financial elements, but equally they should be in relation to the social, the environmental side. If you've got that clarity in your risk appetite, that should flow down into your policies, your procedures, your training, your culture. I mean, again, that linkage between culture and risk appetite, you can really demonstrate to the organisation, and particularly organisations that are distributed, that this is our limits, these are the tram lines that we operate within, and these are the things that we will and will not do. So bringing in your S&G elements into your risk appetite and articulating them fully is incredibly important.
But those have to be driven by qualitative and quantitative measures, don't they, on that risk appetite, to know that you're within those thresholds.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's some sort of quantitative aspects of it. I mean, take modern slavery for example, or some of that areas, but equally the qualitative around some of the social elements, and a degree some of the sort of environmental elements as well, in terms of it is, we have taken a view as a board that this is activities we do, activities we don't do as an organisation. And go back to my sort of buying Russian oil point, perfectly permissible, but something that you decide as an organisation you don't want to do because it has that reputational risk.
Okay. And again, the role and importance of governance and the role and importance of the board is to drive good and positive ESG behaviours through the firm. I just want to jump in to both of you. Question for you, for both of you, is that can the prevailing risk culture within an organisation make it significantly better or worse at managing ESG risks? Have you seen that happening where clearly there is a rise because of poor governance or poor risk culture, that obviously rising to the top of those issues are going to be ESG risks rather than opportunities?
I mean, certainly, culture is always driven by tone from the top. So there's that expectation that the board is doing two things. One, articulating the risk culture quite clearly within the organisation, but equally holding themselves and others to account throughout the organisation. So if people are acting in countercultural ways within the organisation, not rewarding them for that, not promoting them because of that, not rewarding them, living the cliche, living the values within the organisation.
How much does therefore remuneration have a part to play in driving ESG behaviours then?
I mean, it has a huge amount of it. If you think about remuneration within the holistic reward area, so, pound notes in people's pockets, bonuses, but also that broader performance management framework as well. If you're not building ESG elements into your performance management, equally into your recruitment and development of people as well, then the business will always be operating on sort of thin foundations. Realistically, I mean, it's all very well to have a policy, to have a procedure, but if you're not rewarding people, driving people in accordance to those procedures and those values, then the system is not going to work effectively.
There is a danger that if we don't set those parameters up and we set those tone from the top, as you say, that there's a danger that that the mice will play, and that we get potentials of greenwashing and mis-selling. Their regulator is so hot on this at the moment, isn't it? And a lot of negative headlines about the propensity and the dangers of that. Are firms responding to that positively and proactively, Frank, towards those issues and addressing those proportionately and reasonably?
Not as much as they should. I mean, take your greenwashing example there. In firms where this was happening, it was doubtless the case that people were getting rewarded for this. I mean, that's the nature of the beast. People tend not to wake up in the morning and think, I want to breach regulation, or I want to do something that is that is wrong. The vast majority of people. But if you build a reward structure which encourages behaviours which are counter to these professed cultural norms that you've put in there, your ESG aspirations that you've got on your poster, then it is always going to fail. So if you're not calling out people for doing wrong, or you're rewarding people for doing wrong, then the foundations of that ESG framework is always going to be problematic.
I would argue that looking at the way a lot of firms have approached training of their people in this area, the competence hasn't landed. So holding Tarquin to account for doing something wrong, is perhaps a little unfair if what was trained to him was either insufficient and/or didn't land. So I think it's a difficult rock and a hard place type conversation. Well, listen, you've been trained, you haven't done this. Well, yeah, I had a one-on-one training course, and that was 6 months ago, and we haven't really talked about it since. And therefore unreasonable to expect me to retain all this reasonably complex material. So I think that will prevail. I see that prevailing, and we frequently get asked. It is a risk, because I think it goes beyond ethics. You can't say it's unethical behaviour if I didn't genuinely know it was.
Yeah, and I think that's where you've taken the question out of my mind, actually. Yeah, sorry, Frank, you're going to jump in.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely agreeing. And the training in this area is not simple, because particularly if we're talking on the social side, it can be quite nuanced, it can be quite subjective, and you can't necessarily cover all eventualities. So you're trying to instill within members of the team the doing the right thing, as you've defined it, concepts, rather than, back to our sort of comments earlier, a tick box, we don't do this, we don't do that, we don't do the other. It is more, it is more subjective, more subtle training required.
And it's critical.
Sorry, Philip. Tick box isn't going to get you there. It's going to give you the option. You're going to point at something, but it's going to work against you, because what firms need to succeed in this area is an authentic culture, and ticking a box and letting people get on with it is an inauthentic culture.
Yeah, and if we want the right behaviours and the appropriate behaviours, we've got to drive that through the organisation, and there has to be an element and relevancy of the training, meaningful training, regular training, to actually make sure that happens there. What we've done is that we've done on this, what we've produced on this slide, Frank, is that we've talked about a good practice element to what firms should be doing, could be doing, to start that journey of aligning the strategy, the ESG approach, as well as the strategy. And you've highlighted two areas, number 1 and number 4 and number 7. Just sort of talk us through about board composition, because we haven't talked about D&I and what that means at the board. Also awareness gathering as well, getting the MI that one needs to make decisions.
Yeah, I mean, the sort of diversity and inclusion has become much more relevant to organisations, and there's expectations from the FCA around how you'll fulfil that. Personal view, when we're talking about diversity, it should be a greater consideration of diversity of thought, diversity of attitude, diversity of background, as opposed to just ethnicity and gender. So I think it's important, and we keep referring to the same comments, don't just do tick boxes on this one. Just because somebody's a particular gender, just because somebody's a particular race, doesn't necessarily mean that they will be bringing anything different to the party than others. So thinking about the diversity in terms of diversity of thought and attitude is kind of the ultimate objective of what everybody's trying to do in this area.
And then when we look at awareness, there's the MI that we have and the MI that we want around ESG matters.
Yeah, absolutely. And presenting it in a sufficient detail that the board can understand it and can draw conclusions from it. And back to the point about board composition, having a people on the board who can actually understand this information as it's presented to them and take suitable action off the back of it is important. But again, going back to the sort of quantitative via qualitative, bringing in some of those more intangible metrics, some of those more subtle sort of metrics and data points in there as well. So not just the black and white, you know, yes, we haven't enslaved anybody this month, give us a tick. You know, there's more to it than that. Certainly.
Yeah. I just want to just a sidebar issue there. Are you seeing the rise of the chief sustainable officer, chief impact officer, or head of ESG having a board position, or is that prevalent in firms that you're working with?
So it's a really interesting question. And funnily enough, I was just chatting to a chief sustainability officer last night. It is a growing trend without question, and I think there is benefit to it, but the reasoning behind it has to be right. I mean, if it is just, we go back to our sort of greenwashing concept. If you're just giving somebody a title and sticking them there, and you know, effectively their job is watering the green wall in reception and not doing much else, then it is not doing anything substantial. If they're embedded in the decisioning process of the organisation, if they are highlighting some of those more subtle risks, highlighting the challenges of the organisation, equally the opportunities, and being that sort of, you know, conscience, social conscience to the board, then they can add value. It's important to understand what their role is in comparison to chief risk officer, chief business officer, for example. So how they actually fit in and where the value has been added. So yes, can have benefits, but what you don't want to do is sort of, you know, silo, ghettoize, just put it in the corner. ESG, we've ticked that box, we've got our chief sustainability officer.
Adrian, we've moved beyond what is ESG and what is governance around ESG and why that's important. But now boards need to be thinking about how are they going to implement and embed their ESG commitments. And here on the slide here, we've got at the bottom, we've got the mission, vision, and values, of course. But we've got to drive those behaviors and those beliefs and those new attitudes throughout the organization. And critically, we've got to make sure that the board is competent about discharging that themselves, don't they? And it can't be just subbed out to a chief sustainability officer. There's got to be an understanding at the top of those issues and then disseminates to the desired culture that the firm wants to obtain.
Yeah, I mean, what I've learned about change is, whilst it would be lovely to flick a switch and we change, yeah, that's what never happens. Change is actually an iterative, long-term process. It's a sort of, if you put there, continuous improvement. You can't do it to an organization. You can't do change to an organization because you won't bring along the people with you, which is why I keep coming back to this cultural point. So the exec certainly needs to know their stuff. I think it would be fair to say a lot of the executive are probably more confused about what they should be doing with ESG than clear. And whilst culture is set from the top, the tone from the top, Frank, yeah, I think where most firms want to get to, where ESG is a fundamental is part of their cultural makeup, that's going to come from the boots on the ground, to use one of your phrases, Philip, before it's going to come from the tone on the top. Yeah, because that's where I think the rubber hits the road, where you've got employees that care. Yeah, but they've got to care, they've got to understand it. Yeah, they've got to be able to cut through. There's so much information out there. What are the bits that they need to learn? What are the bits they need to go and look up? Where are they going to go and look this up? There's a lot there. And I think it is a continuous activity, and it is not a box ticking activity. But we'll see. We'll see. I think there's some epic fails in this area. I'm sorry, it's sad to say. I'm absolutely certain we will.
Yeah. I mean, you know, absolutely agree with the sort of boots on the ground concept. And you often get within organisations, and I'm sure you see this a lot, the sort of frozen middle. So you get your guys at the top, your board who want the change. You've got your guys at the sharp end who are saying we need to do something differently for our customers. But you have that sort of middle management section of the organisation who is not allowing the message to get through or resisting.
I think the regulator refers to it as the permafrost, don't they? In the middle of the organisation. We've listed 4 action points that boards could take to gen up or scale up themselves for long-term ESG success. Adrian, do you want to just pick up on 1 or 2 of these issues that you think are vital to lead on ESG and particularly the governance side?
I like point 4. Yeah. Gaining experience of handling difficult ESG conversations and responding to ESG crises. We were working with a firm I can't name who were looking at this concept in a what's the word I'm looking for? In a sort of generic way. And the conclusion that we got to through the process was, if you really want to help your people, get this and your organization to change, you need to make it intensely personal. Our conclusion was, you need to capture failings from within your own business and replay those failings to people in your business, because that's what resonates. You know, pointing to some firm in the States that doesn't do anything similar to what you do and say, look what happened to them, just it's like, so what, right? Not being funny, but I don't care. Yeah, and I'm probably, my learning value from that is negligible, if anything. Yeah. However, when it's intensely personal, it's about your organization. Yeah. And perhaps you could read between the lines and say, I think I know who might have done that. Yeah. It becomes far more real and the learning value far higher. So for me, that gained experience is about sharing that experience with your enterprise. How do you socialize that in a non-bullying way? Yeah, so we don't want to hang people out to dry. Yeah, how do you socialize that, and how do you learn from those experiences? That's what's going to change your culture. That's what's going to arm your people, your exec, your management, yeah, and your frontline staff to be competent in this area. Yeah, so I like that one.
No, ESG stories are definitely the way forward to respond to conversations and ESG crises, which will have an impact in terms of like reputational risk, which we'll go on to. You put in your article, Frank, there's a long way from the boardroom to the front line, and a lot can go wrong between the expectations of the board and implementing policies, processes, procedures there. Where could it go wrong? And what could firms do to flag that and address that before there are consequences, negative consequences to that happening?
Yeah, and you've got sort of, you've got two arrows on this one. So you've got the sort of information from the business side of things. So that ability of the board to actually understand what's going on in the organization. I always like to put the pyramid this way around. You normally see it the other way around, with a board sort of at the top of an organization. I mean, the reality is, particularly these days with SMCR, that they're slightly precarious in some respects. There's an awful lot of pressure on top of them from a large unwieldy organization. So being able to get those insights from the sharp end. I mean, if you take things like different market sectors, say fashion, for example, a lot of cheap clothes on the shops, a lot of those clothes perhaps being made by contractors or subcontractors, particularly, who are not paying their workers very much money, or not having very good health and safety records. So being able to know what's going on in widely distributed organizations, particularly around outsourcing and subcontracting activity, is incredibly important. So back to classic management theory, the sort of management by walking about concept, getting out into the organization, not just relying on our frozen middle, our permafrost to tell us what's going on, and being cautious about that filtering that goes on in organizations. If you've got a don't ask, don't tell culture, only give me good news, then inherently that is what you're going to get. People will tell you everything's fine, all our MI is green, when in reality that may not be the case. So it goes back to our culture point. You'll get what you ask for in organizations, and you'll in some respects get what you'll deserve in terms of the information you get. So if you've got the wrong culture, then inherently risks will occur. Equally, the other side of the graph there is the direction to the business of how do you push that message out, and how do you get it down the line to those people at the sharp end in the organization in an unfiltered manner?
Yeah. And without it being reframed.
Sorry, Philip, to interrupt you. One of the things that we frequently see with firms is the quantification of risk pertaining to their people is a void. So you look at, my favourite quote is one about, at British Gas, we knew more about the performance of our photocopiers, or multifunctional devices they're now called, than we genuinely understood about our thousands and thousands of employees. Yeah. So the risks from the photocopiers, we know that. Risks from the people, all got very, very fluffy. So in this respect, this is something that we engage a lot with firms, is helping firms quantify and mitigate those risks arising from the workforce. And I've seen risk registers in all walks of past career, and when it gets to the people bit, it all gets fluffy. And I see in this ESG respect that as a classic area for fail. Not being able to quantify it, you can't manage it.
Yeah. And I mean, we are service sector businesses, financial services, and your risk is 100% people risk. It is effectively, you've got no machinery breaking or anything like that. It is people either not knowing what they should do or doing the wrong thing. Is your risk.
And that puts a reliance upon the role of compliance and also the role of risk management and risk teams there. Don't want to go through everything on this slide, but I think it's important that it starts with a gap analysis, top left-hand corner, doesn't it, Frank?
Yeah, absolutely. It is the honest conversation within the organization, drawing in the experts from the business and assessing it with senior management to say, across our whole risk landscape, what are the gaps in terms of our alignment with what we know from our horizon scanning, from our understanding of it, in terms of what we need to comply with, both on the sort of hard regulatory side of ESG, but equally on we do not want to stray into these areas, reputational risk side, on particularly on the S side as well. So doing that gap analysis, and then from that seeing if there's any misalignment to the business model, the strategy of the organization. I mean, we go back to talking about sort of extractive industries. If your investment model is entirely based on investments into coal or shale gas or something like that, then perhaps your model is less sustainable than you think it is going forward. So looking at your business strategy and then building those controls into your risk appetite, in the sense of, either we don't work in this marketplace, or we only work into this marketplace at a certain level. We don't do these activities, those kind of controls.
Critical for compliance and risk managers, Adrian, to put in the right components in place to develop the methods, the processes, and the tools for dealing with ESG risks. Are they looking at that at the moment? Heads of compliance, chief risk officers that you're talking to, and are they embedding that, like we see in bottom right hand side of this quadrant, and monitoring, assessing that on the left hand side?
I don't know, I'm only talking to the ones that are. So I can't speak from all, but certainly from firms that we are talking to, but my takeaway. So when I came to this subject with you guys, my takeaway is that I think most firms look at it and say, from an employee competence point of view, this is complicated. There's a lot there. Yeah. So doing a training course, on ESG and getting back on with your work, we're not speaking with those organizations. Organizations that are saying this is a critical component part of our future strategy, and we want to be match fit. We're talking to those organizations, because it's about learning the stuff that has to be learned and retaining that, and knowing where to go and find the right answers. So that's what we're spending a deal of time talking to firms about ESG. But I keep coming back to the overarching feedback we get is this is complicated, this is difficult. And a tool used to make it easier. But in my opinion, I see that. You knew my view when I turned up to plan this webinar. It does look a very complicated space. Frank, you've got a great habit of being able to make it to cut through it and simplify it, but it's a big impact to an organization.
Hey, we haven't finished the webinar before we high five each other. Let the feedback come in before we do that.
Sorry, Frank, I retract that.
Leaders or followers. We wanted to leave this, one of the last slides that we've got on this, to really help and support firms, trigger a thought process, Frank, into what they could be doing next. And you picked out 4 key areas out of the 8 we've got on the screen here, perhaps where they need to kick the tires on, either as chief compliance officers or heads of risk, or even board members who've got listening in on this there. But start off with risk identification.
Yeah, I mean, the important thing to do is look sufficiently broadly at the risk landscape. So there's an often concept of sort of green myopia. So yes, I'll look at these particular risks in this area, but ignore some of the wider ones and some of the more nuanced ones, particularly around the social side, and also recognizing the fact that risks will crystallize over a longer timeline than firms are used to. Most firms are working on a sort of 3 to 5 years timeline, whereas some of the environmental risks will inherently crystallize longer. Equally, some of the social risks as well. I mean, in the article on LinkedIn, I was talking about the concept of the Overton window, which is the sort of what is acceptable to the public at any given time point, and that absolutely does shift and change. So it's not normally on firms' radar, but if we're thinking about reputational risk and social risk, that's the kind of thing that firms need to be tracking as well. So the much more holistic view. I mean, they're all risks, and it should be within your risk control self-assessment process, your risk capture process, but they are distinct from some of the, credit risk, market risk, liquidity risk that maybe firms are used to.
Board intelligence, number 4. You're going to say that this is a priority, Adrian. We've still got to improve the fluency in ESG issues on the board, but also cascade that throughout the organization.
I think fluency is a really good word. Yeah, because it talks to much more than ticking a box. Yeah, it talks to, fluency for me is deep understanding and comprehension. Yeah, so do I see many firms tackling it with that level of intent? We see some, but the vast majority, I don't think, are seeking to be fluent. I think they're seeking to get by with ordering a beer at the bar.
Effective governance is only going to come through ESG metrics, isn't it? Where the board can see that having an impact, having a significance. Otherwise, it just becomes hot air, and energy and time spent is wasted there. The challenge for people on the webinar will be actually quantifying this, won't it? And creating some meaningful metrics to see that they are operating within their risk appetite, but also that they are looking at opportunities, not just risks, Frank.
Yeah, absolutely. And in terms of the quantified and what sort of metrics you use, it is that linkage between the two. So that recognition at the top that you have a risk, and then the challenge at the bottom to say, okay, fine, how do I know if I'm inside or outside of tolerance of this risk or not? And if you combine those two together, then you're should be forcing the organization to come to a conclusion of, okay, fine, this will be the metric I need for this. Or if you haven't got the metrics, then that's right back to the top of your risk register in terms of, we have an unquantifiable risk here that we know is there, but we can't actually tell whether we're inside or outside of tolerance.
Yeah. 3 options available on the screen. Thank you very much to those people who have already jumped ahead of what I'm going to say, but you've got 3 options. Reach out to Hogan Lovells and to Frank directly to develop the clear strategic response He's alluded to some tools there which Hogan Lovells have on offer and available. So I'll pin his details in to the follow-up email, which will accompany the slide deck as well. And also the opportunity to book a demonstration from Elephants Don't Forget to look at how you can embed your approach to ESG effectively, fluently and robustly within the organization. That was a mouthful. And therefore you can access our range of papers and blogs and webinars on ESG as well, indicating that now. Thank you very much for that. And finally, there we want to just get your feedback. We're always kind of like going through how we can improve our webinars and how we can use those effectively to not just occupy your time on a very, very hot summer's day, but also to actually capture some of the impact and some of the learnings from that, so we can actually translate that into other forthcoming webinars and there. So capturing that by, can you use this session information immediately? 2 months, 6 months, 7 months? Never. Hopefully you won't say that to us. And also, what percentage of information was new to you? Was it completely new, or was it just an affirmation of what you already understand? We hope that this has been some sort of a positive challenge. And if you want more detail about that, again, Frank, is it still up there, your LinkedIn, your article on
yes, absolutely,
GSE? Haven't got that qualification yet, but I'm working towards it. Okay, that's lost in translation to the new generation. But anyway, thank you very much. Any questions that people have, or any summary that panelists you want to conclude with?
I mean, from my perspective, the two takeaways I'd ask people to think about is its governance across all your elements of control within the organization, and they are risks as the same as any other risk, which need to be controlled. It's, it's not a different framework.
And data, evidence, MI, Adrian, is going to be critical if they are going to be successful. Firms are going to be successful in this, aren't they?
Yep. And back to Frank's point, all your risks are people-based. And right now, I suggest for most firms, that's opaque. If you can't quantify it, you can't manage it. So that feels quite scary. It always did to me when I had a massive group of people and you couldn't quantify it. So that's what, for me, you got to quantify it. If you're serious about this and not greenwashing, you've got to quantify that risk and manage it.
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you very much for your time, and appreciate the feedback. And yes, somebody's just mentioned, yes, the slides and also will be sent out to you, accompanied by a recording of this webinar. Thank you very much for your time today. Take care. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Good job.
So, thanks.
Let's see. Did you want to stay on, Frank?
Yeah, we can stay on. Yeah.